Right now, in a quiet city in the middle of China, there is a woman who lights 2 candles every Friday evening. She does not know all the prayers. She has never stepped inside a real synagogue. Her government does not even recognize her religion as something that exists. Her neighbors walk past her house with no idea what she is doing behind that closed door, but inside her cells, written in a language far older than any spoken language, is a code that scientists can now read with total certainty. The code links her, in an unbroken line, to Jewish communities that lived in Persia and Babylon more than 1,000 years ago. She is one of the last living descendants of the Jews of Kaifeng. And what modern science has just confirmed about her ancestors is one of the strangest, most moving stories most people have never heard. Picture the year 960. In Europe, this is still the so-called Dark Ages. But in China, a city named Kaifeng is the largest, richest, most advanced city on the entire planet. Not Baghdad, not Rome, not Constantinople, Kaifeng. More than 1 million people live inside its walls. Canals cut through the streets like arteries. Merchants from a dozen different lands push through its markets, trading silk, spices, cotton, paper, and ideas. And somewhere along the long chain of desert roads linking Persia, Central Asia, India, and China, the road's history would later name the Silk Road. A small group of Jewish traders makes a choice that will still be echoing 1,000 years later. Here is the first thing that makes their story unusual. They were not running from anything. Most Jewish communities scattered across the world because they were forced out, chased away by violence, by expulsion, by massacre. But the Jews who ended up in Kaifeng do not appear to have arrived as refugees. They arrived as businessmen, as people chasing a market, not escaping a mob. These were confident, well-traveled, multilingual traders who looked at the wealth and openness of the Chinese Empire and decided this was a good place to put down roots. That single fact makes the Kaifeng community different from almost every other Jewish community that has ever existed. For hundreds of years afterward, nobody could say for certain exactly where these people had come from. Were they from Persia? From Iraq? From India? Some mixture of all three? The community itself left behind a handful of clues. Stone tablets, old prayer books, fragments of records, written in a confusing blend of Hebrew, Judeo-Persian, and classical Chinese. Every historian who studied these fragments came away with a slightly different theory. It became one of the oldest unsolved riddles in the study of Jewish history. Then, in 2024, a team of geneticists quietly released a set of results that finally cracked the mystery open. Not through old paper, through DNA. Researchers working on a project studying ancient Jewish genetics managed to test the Y chromosome DNA of men from 4 separate, well-documented family lines within the Kaifeng Jewish community. These were not random volunteers. These were men whose family trees had been carefully traced back, generation by generation, to the historical Jewish clans of Kaifeng. And when the lab results came back, they told a story more precise than any old manuscript ever could. 2 of the 4 family lines carried genetic markers with a clear, direct connection to Jewish populations from the Middle East. One line, tied to a family that carries the surname Shur, a name meaning stone given to Kaifeng's Jewish families by imperial order back in the 1400s, matched a genetic marker shared with the Bukharan Jews of Uzbekistan. Genealogists estimate that the most recent shared ancestor between these 2 groups lived around the year 1000, which is exactly the moment historians believe the Kaifeng Jewish community was first taking shape. That is not a coincidence. That is a biological timestamp confirming both when these people arrived and which direction they came from. But the story does not stop there, and this is where it becomes even more interesting. A second genetic line showed a probable, still being studied connection to Jewish communities in Iraq. And the 4th line carried a genetic marker that is common across East Asia, one with no known link to any Jewish population anywhere else on the planet. Sit with that for a second. One of the 4 surviving Jewish family lines in Kaifeng is, genetically speaking, simply Chinese, with 0 trace of Middle Eastern ancestry. What does that tell us? It tells us that across the centuries, the community absorbed Chinese men into its ranks, through marriage, through conversion, through the slow, quiet blending that happens naturally when a small group lives in near total isolation for 1,000 years. The Jewish identity of the community did not vanish, but its bloodline began to mix. And this is where everything about the story shifts, because the DNA evidence does more than answer where the Kaifeng Jews came from. It answers a much bigger question. What actually happens to a community when it is completely cut off from the rest of its civilization for 1,000 years? What survives? What changes? What disappears entirely? The Kaifeng Jews may be the most extreme real-world test case in Jewish history for that question, and the answer is both beautiful and heartbreaking. To understand what happened to them, you first have to understand what Kaifeng actually offered them. In its golden age, Kaifeng was a carefully planned city, wrapped in 3 rings of walls, with the emperor's palace sitting at its very center. The Jewish community settled well inside those walls, close to the heart of the city, And in the year 1163, they built their first synagogue there. This was not some hidden, marginal group tucked away at the edge of society. This was a community confident enough to build a large, permanent house of worship in the middle of the most powerful city on earth. They were not hiding, they were flourishing. And remarkably, the ruling Song dynasty seems to have genuinely respected them. While their fellow Jews across Europe were being blamed for plagues, driven out of cities, and forced into hiding during the very same century, the Jews of Kaifeng were sitting at imperial banquets, serving in the Chinese civil service, and building synagogues with the government's blessing. Picture that contrast for a moment. The same era that saw Jewish communities slaughtered in the Rhineland was, for the Jews of Kaifeng, a time of comfort, respect, and quiet prosperity. But here comes the twist. The very thing that made Kaifeng so welcoming would eventually be the thing that unraveled the community from within. When a minority group faces no outside hostility, when nobody's trying to erase them, exclude them, or force them into a ghetto, a different, quieter force starts working on them instead. Simple, voluntary, generation by generation, blending into the culture around them. And in Kaifeng, that force had nothing pushing back against it. Slowly, through intermarriage with their Han Chinese and Chinese Muslim neighbors, the community's distinct customs began to fade. By the 1800s, almost nothing of their religious practice remained, only fragments of memory that their ancestors had once belonged to something called Judaism. Think about what that really means. A community that had kept its Jewish identity alive for roughly 700 years, building synagogues, guarding Torah scrolls, practicing circumcision, resting on the Sabbath, eventually reached a point where all that was left was memory, not practice, not structure, not community life, just a faint sense, passed down from grandparents, that the family used to be something different. Natural disasters sped up the process. In 1642, during the collapsing final years of the Ming Dynasty, the Yellow River, the same river that had already flooded Kaifeng disastrously more than once, rose up and destroyed the synagogue completely. The Torah scrolls were lost in the flood. The line of rabbis, already thin, was broken for good. Without a synagogue to gather around and without rabbis to pass down knowledge, the slow fade turned into a rapid collapse. Within a couple of generations, most of the community could no longer read Hebrew. Within a couple more, they could no longer pray in any traditional sense. They kept a few scattered food customs. They remembered they were somehow different from their neighbors. But the daily practice, the living tradition, the institutions that had held Jewish life together for centuries, all of it was gone. And for 1,000 years, the rest of the Jewish world had absolutely no idea any of this was happening. No community in Europe knew Kaifeng's Jews existed. No community in the Middle East had ever heard of them. They lived in a total bubble, cut off not just culturally, but geographically, at the far eastern edge of the known trading world. By the end of the 900s, the dynasty that had kept the Silk Road safe collapsed. And over the following centuries, the route connecting China to the Middle East grew dangerous and eventually faded away completely. The very road that had carried these merchants to China closed quietly behind them, like a door swinging shut. The first outsider from the West to stumble onto this hidden community was not a historian. He was a Jesuit missionary named Matteo Ricci. In 1605, a young Chinese man visited Ricci's mission and told him he belonged to a community of monotheists living in a city called Kaifeng. Ricci was stunned. He had traveled to China assuming he was bringing word of the God of Abraham to people who had never heard of him. Instead, standing right in front of him was a man who already believed in one God, rested on Saturdays, refused to eat pork, and claimed to have Hebrew books at home. At first, Ricci wondered if the man might be some kind of lost Christian. Once he realized the man was Jewish, it became one of the strangest and most remarkable meetings in the entire history of contact between distant civilizations. 3 years later, Ricci sent a Chinese Jesuit to Kaifeng to investigate further, and everything was confirmed. The community observed the Sabbath and major Jewish holidays, practiced circumcision, read from the Torah, owned Hebrew manuscripts, used carved name tablets rather than pictures in their house of worship, and still avoided pork. The essential markers of Jewish life were still present in the early 1600s, but the clock, unknown to anyone at the time, was already running out. Within a few decades, the flood would come, the synagogue would be destroyed, and the chain connecting generation to generation would finally snap. By the time Western scholars began seriously studying the community in the 1800s and 1900s, what they found were people who remembered being Jewish, but who could no longer practice Judaism in any meaningful way. This is exactly why the genetic research from 2024 matters so much. For roughly 100 years, scholars had argued fiercely over one loaded question. Were the Kaifeng Jews really, genuinely Jewish by ancestry? Or had centuries of intermarriage diluted that original bloodline into something close to meaningless? Some historians believed the community had absorbed so many local converts and spouses that any authentic Middle Eastern Jewish ancestry had essentially disappeared. Others argued that because Kaifeng Jewish identity passed down through the father's line, that male lineage had preserved a real traceable thread back to the Middle East, no matter what else had changed. The 2024 genetic study settled this argument with a level of precision no old document could ever offer. It confirmed a clear Persian and Central Asian migration pattern, showing genetic markers that link certain Kaifeng family lines to Kurdish Jews and to Bukharan Jews, a pattern consistent with people traveling along the Silk Road out of Middle Eastern Jewish communities sometime between the 700s and the 900s. Kurdish Jews and Bukharan Jews are among the oldest continuously surviving Jewish communities anywhere in the world, descendants of the ancient Babylonian and Persian Jewish diaspora, tracing their unbroken presence in the region back more than 2,000 years. And the Kaifeng Jews share DNA with these groups, not in some loose symbolic sense, in the most literal, laboratory-confirmed sense possible. But the genetic story also reveals the full, complicated truth. Over the generations, the community intermarried heavily with local Han Chinese men and women, which is exactly why one of the 4 surviving lineages carries a purely East Asian genetic marker, with no Jewish connection at all. This is the complete picture, Jewish by origin, transformed by 1,000 years of life in China. The science is not telling us they were never really Jewish. The science is telling us they were Jewish, and that they became Chinese too. Both things are true at once. That does not make their story smaller. It makes it far more extraordinary. There is another twist buried in this same research, one that stretches the story in a direction almost nobody expects. Laboratory studies have found that Ashkenazi Jews, the Jewish communities of Eastern Europe, typically carry around 2 to 3% East Asian ancestry in their genetic makeup. This shows up consistently across thousands of Ashkenazi participants tested in large genetic ancestry projects. Think about what that quietly implies. The Silk Road was not just carrying Jewish genes eastward into China, it was carrying them back westward too. Somewhere, buried deep in the family tree of Ashkenazi Jewry, there is very likely a Chinese woman whose descendants eventually settled in Poland, Ukraine, or Lithuania, and became ancestors of Jewish communities that would go on to produce scientists, writers, philosophers, and Nobel Prize winners. Meanwhile, in China, Jewish traders who married local women saw their own descendants become steadily more Chinese in both culture and blood. 2 opposite journeys, both rooted in the same ancient trade routes, both leaving Jewish communities today who are, in a very real biological sense, heirs to 2 of the oldest civilizations on Earth at once. Now let's bring this into the present, because this is not simply ancient history. The descendants of Kaifeng's Jews are alive today, and what they are dealing with right now, in 2025 and 2026, is one of the most complicated identity struggles happening anywhere in the world. Today, only a few hundred descendants remain in Kaifeng, in China's Henan province, all that is left of a community that once numbered around 5,000 people in a city of 1 million. What remains are a handful of families still carrying the surnames handed to their ancestors by imperial decree centuries ago, and who feel, to varying degrees, from deep personal conviction to vague, half-remembered family stories, that they are connected to something ancient. Some of them want to move to Israel, and this is exactly where the story collides head-on with modern politics. For a while, before being shut down, an Israeli charity organization worked to help Kaifeng's Jewish descendants reconnect with their heritage, helping arrange birthright trips, conversion processes, and immigration to Israel. But the Chinese government does not officially recognize Jews as a distinct ethnic group, and it classifies Kaifeng's Jewish descendants simply as Han Chinese. Eventually, authorities moved to block foreign Jewish organizations from operating in the country and discouraged citizens from identifying with a foreign national or religious identity. The reasoning is not really a mystery. Officials have worried that formally recognizing a Jewish minority in Kaifeng could stir tension with China's large Muslim population, especially given decades of shifting alignment in Chinese foreign policy toward the Middle East. The Kaifeng Jews never asked to be caught in the middle of any of this, but history rarely asks permission. There is a further irony sitting at the center of this whole story. Because Kaifeng Jewish identity was traditionally passed down through the father rather than the mother as required under classical Jewish law, most descendants do not automatically qualify under Israel's law of return. To gain Israeli citizenship, many of them must complete a year-long formal conversion process, meaning they have to convert into the religion of their own ancestors in order to be legally recognized as belonging to it. It is one of the strangest ironies in this entire story, and yet some of them are doing exactly that. One young Kaifeng-descended woman now serves as a non-commissioned artillery officer in the Israeli military. Back in China, her family's Jewish identity was never officially acknowledged, and her own birth had technically violated the country's one-child policy at the time. Picture that entire arc. A woman born in China into a family punished by the state simply for having her, whose Jewish ancestry the government refused to recognize, who later traveled to Israel, converted, learned Hebrew, completed military training, and ultimately served her new country during wartime. That is not a summary of history. That is the entire 1,000-year journey from Persia to Kaifeng to Jerusalem, compressed into a single lifetime. Other stories are quieter, but just as telling. One woman in her mid-40s spent nearly a decade running a small private museum out of her own home in Kaifeng, dedicated to the history of the city's Jewish community, and led visitors on informal tours. Eventually, the home museum was destroyed, likely by a family member under pressure, and local zoning rules have since blocked her from rebuilding it. As of early 2026, the building still sits empty and unrepaired. This is what quiet cultural erasure actually looks like on the ground, not a dramatic government crackdown. Just a woman who cannot rebuild a small museum in her own house because the machinery of the state has decided her family's history is inconvenient. And yet, interest in this heritage keeps growing rather than fading. Online communities now connect Kaifeng's descendants directly with Jewish educators and organizations worldwide. Some study Torah with rabbis over video calls. Some are learning Hebrew from scratch through apps and online classes. The internet has done something that no Silk Road caravan, no Jesuit missionary, and no 19th century scholar ever managed. It has reconnected Kaifeng to the rest of the Jewish world instantly, and largely beyond the reach of any single government to fully control. But the internet cannot solve the underlying political reality. China's official position remains unchanged. Judaism is not a state-recognized religion, and the descendants of Kaifeng's Jews are, in the eyes of the law, simply Chinese citizens. Their connection to ancient Persian traders is treated as an interesting historical footnote, not a living legal category. Israel, for its part, remains caught between genuine curiosity about the community and the strict legal boundaries of its own immigration law. The 2024 genetic findings have not changed Israeli citizenship law and have not automatically granted anyone new rights. What they have provided is something valuable in a different way. Solid scientific proof that this community's long-claimed Jewish ancestry is not folklore or wishful thinking, but a documented biological fact. Whether that fact ever translates into legal recognition anywhere remains completely unresolved. Underneath all of this sits a much bigger question, one that reaches far beyond this one small community in central China. What actually makes up identity? The genetic research shows us clearly that DNA persists long after culture fades away. You can lose your language. You can lose your religious practice. You can lose your synagogue, your scrolls, your rabbis. You can intermarry for 20 generations and be officially reclassified by your own government as belonging to a completely different ethnic group, and a marker buried in your Y chromosome will still point, with total biological precision, back to a Jewish trader who lived in the mountains of northern Iraq 1,000 years ago. The body remembers what the culture forgot. But is that enough to count as identity on its own? The descendants themselves are divided on this, and their disagreement mirrors a debate happening in identity discussions all over the modern world. Some feel deeply Jewish, not because they practice Judaism or speak Hebrew, but simply because they know where they came from, and that knowledge feels like enough. Others feel entirely Chinese, with an interesting but non-defining Jewish ancestor somewhere far back in the family tree. And others feel something in between, something with no clean label in Hebrew, Chinese, or English, a feeling of belonging fully to two civilizations at once, and fully to neither. The scientists behind the 2024 study were never trying to settle that emotional question. Their job was simply to nail down the biological facts, and they did that with remarkable precision. The historical record backs them up too. Surviving manuscripts from the Kaifeng community are written partly in Judeo-Persian, on the language of ancient Persian Jewry, preserved for centuries in a Chinese city by people who looked Chinese, carried Chinese names, ate Chinese food, and spoke Chinese every single day, yet still reached back to the language of their origin whenever they wrote something sacred. That is not simple assimilation. That is something far more human, an attempt to hold two worlds together inside one small community for as long as humanly possible. They managed to hold on for roughly 700 years before the flood came. The last rabbis died out, and the Hebrew was finally forgotten. 700 years is longer than the entire history of the United States. It is longer than most modern nations have existed at all. Whatever else happened to this community, what they achieved in terms of sheer cultural endurance was extraordinary by any measure. That it eventually ended is not a story of failure. It is simply what happens to any community left isolated long enough, hit by enough disasters, and allowed to pass through enough generations without fresh connection to the outside world. And now, in these early years of a new century, something quietly remarkable is happening again. The isolation is finally ending, not because the old Silk Road has reopened, but because the internet has built something that works almost the same way. a network across which ideas, identities, and communities can travel freely again. Descendants of Kaifeng Jews are reconnecting with the wider Jewish world in ways that would have been simply impossible even 30 years ago. Some are leaving China entirely. Some are staying and quietly trying to rebuild what they can. Some are just exploring, trying to work out what this new genetic evidence actually means for how they see themselves. What most of them are discovering is that their story is not only one of loss, even though real loss runs through every part of it. It is not only a story of failure, even though there is failure woven into it too. At its core, it is a story about how stubborn human identity actually is. How even 1,000 years of isolation, intermarriage, political pressure, and natural disaster could not fully erase the thread connecting a small group of people back to where they came from. The DNA was there the entire time, quietly waiting to be read. A genetic marker sitting inside a man's Y chromosome in Kaifeng has been pointing, without interruption, back across the Himalayas, across the Iranian plateau, across the deserts of ancient Mesopotamia, to the moment 1,000 years ago when his ancestor packed up his trade goods and set off toward China, carrying a religion he intended to keep alive. The real question now, and it genuinely remains open, with consequences nobody can fully predict, is what the world chooses to do with this knowledge. Will Israel eventually adjust its laws for communities whose Jewish ancestry is now scientifically confirmed, even though their religious practice was interrupted for centuries? Will China continue treating the identity of a few hundred people as an inconvenience to be managed quietly? Will Kaifeng's remaining descendants find a way to rebuild something resembling a living Jewish community in the very city where their ancestors raised a synagogue nearly 900 years ago? Or will the last of them simply keep leaving, one by one, pulled by the quiet gravity of an ancient identity toward a country their family has never lived in, but that their DNA has never stopped pointing to? The genetics have already answered where these people came from. They have confirmed the Silk Road route. They have confirmed the Middle Eastern Jewish origin. They have confirmed the 1,000-year biological thread linking a handful of families in central China back to the ancient Jewish communities of Persia and Iraq. What they have not answered, what no laboratory test ever could, is what happens next. Whether identity is something that can be proven in a lab, or whether it has to be lived, practiced, and rebuilt by hand, generation after generation. Whether the Jews of Kaifeng are witnessing the final chapter of their story, or the fragile, uncertain beginning of a new one. Somewhere in central China tonight, a woman will light 2 candles as the sun goes down on a Friday evening. She may be the last person carrying this particular thread forward, or she may be the first of a new chapter that hasn't been written yet. Either way, carried quietly inside her, is the genetic memory of one of the most extraordinary journeys in human history. A journey that is, even now, still not finished being written.